The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like expensive leather and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Seattle skyline, where rain streaked down glass like tears the city refused to acknowledge. Martin Torres adjusted the strap of his worn delivery bag as he stepped off the elevator, his boots leaving faint wet marks on the marble floor. His navy blue uniform had seen better days, the company logo faded from too many washes, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd spent decades doing work that left marks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He was 53 years old, and today he was running behind schedule. 3 more deliveries after this one, and his daughter's medication needed to be picked up before the pharmacy closed at 6. But as he approached the glass doors of Sterling Industries' executive suite, something in his chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly. More like the recognition that some moments arrive wearing the disguise of ordinary errands. The receptionist barely glanced up as Martin entered, her fingers dancing across a keyboard with the kind of speed that suggested she'd stopped seeing people as individuals years ago. He cleared his throat softly and placed a large envelope on her desk, the kind with cardboard reinforcement that promised important documents inside. "Delivery for Victoria Chen," he said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd smoked in his younger years and quit too late to erase all the evidence. "Legal documents. Needs a signature." The receptionist's eyes flicked to his uniform, then to his weathered face, then back to her screen. "She's in a meeting. You can leave it here." Martin shook his head gently. "Protocol says executive level requires direct signature. Legal liability and all that." Before she could respond, the conference room doors swung open and voices spilled out like expensive wine from a tipped glass. Victoria Chen emerged first, her presence filling the hallway with the kind of energy that made junior employees straighten their spines involuntarily. Behind her trailed 3 men in suits that probably cost more than Martin's monthly rent, their faces arranged in expressions of carefully maintained interest. Victoria stopped mid-sentence when she noticed Martin standing by the reception desk, his delivery bag slung over one shoulder like a soldier's pack. Her eyes performed a quick assessment, the kind that took in his scuffed boots, his rain-dampened jacket, the slight stoop in his shoulders that comes from carrying weight for too long. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already calculating how quickly this interruption could be resolved. Martin held up the envelope. "Delivery for you, ma'am. Legal documents from Prescott and Associates. I need your signature." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Just leave it with reception." Martin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his brown eyes, something patient and immovable. "I'm afraid I can't do that. These are contract amendments for the Riverside merger. My instructions are clear. Direct signature from the recipient or the delivery doesn't count as completed." One of the suited men behind Victoria, a silver-haired executive named Richard Hartley, let out a soft chuckle. "Victoria, you can't be serious. We have the Jameson call in 10 minutes. Just sign the man's paper so he can get back to his route." Victoria extended her hand with the kind of impatience that comes from having too many important things demanding attention simultaneously. "Fine. Give it here." Martin pulled the envelope from his bag and handed it over, along with his electronic signature pad. Victoria scrawled her name across the screen without looking, her attention already returning to Richard and the conversation they'd been having about quarterly projections and market positioning. But as Martin took back the device, he glanced at the envelope Victoria was now holding and noticed something that made him pause. The seal on the back had been broken. Not obviously, but enough that someone with attention to detail might notice. He'd picked up this delivery from the law firm himself just 90 minutes ago, and he distinctly remembered that seal being intact. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Miss Chen, I think there might be an issue." Victoria had already turned back toward the conference room, but something in Martin's tone made her stop. She turned, her expression now edged with irritation. "What issue?" Martin pointed at the envelope. "That seal. It was intact when I picked this up." Someone's opened it. Victoria glanced at the envelope, then back at Martin with the kind of look that could freeze water. Are you suggesting I open my own mail before you delivered it? That's absurd. No ma'am, Martin said evenly. I'm suggesting someone at the law firm might have made an error. Or possibly there's been some kind of mix-up. These are legal documents. If the seal's broken, the chain of custody is compromised. Richard Hartley laughed outright now, a sound like expensive scotch being poured over ice. Chain of custody? Victoria, I think your delivery man has been watching too many legal dramas. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened the envelope and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers bound with a blue backing. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, her irritation giving way to focused concentration. After a moment, she looked up at Martin with an expression that had shifted from annoyance to something closer to contempt. These are the contract amendments I've been expecting, she said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. Everything appears to be in order. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I don't know what you think you saw, but I assure you this is exactly what it should be. Martin didn't move. With respect, ma'am, may I see the first page? Victoria's eyes widened slightly. You want to see confidential corporate documents? You're a delivery driver. Just the first page, Martin repeated quietly. Something's not right. The other executives had now formed a small semicircle, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright disdain. One of them, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses named Derek Walsh, shook his head slowly. This is incredible. Victoria, you don't have to indulge this. The man delivered an envelope. His job is done. But something in Martin's steady gaze seemed to penetrate Victoria's armor of certainty. Perhaps it was the complete absence of aggression in his bearing, or maybe it was the way he stood there with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that truth doesn't require raised voices to make itself known. She thrust the first page toward him with a sharp motion. Fine. Look. Then leave. Martin took the paper carefully, his eyes moving across the dense legal text with a speed that surprised everyone watching. His brow furrowed slightly as he reached the third paragraph, and then his expression shifted into something that might have been recognition or might have been disappointment. This isn't right, he said quietly. Victoria snatched the paper back. Excuse me? Martin met her eyes directly. That clause in Section 3, subsection B. The liability language has been altered. The original contract you negotiated with Riverside Limited had mutual indemnification. This version puts all liability on Sterling Industries. If anything goes wrong with the merger, your company absorbs every loss. The hallway went silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled sound of traffic 42 floors below. Victoria's face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that precedes either fury or fear. How would you possibly know what was in the original contract? She asked, her voice dangerously soft. Martin shifted his weight slightly, his delivery bag creaking with the movement. I wouldn't, he admitted. But I know contract law. And I know that clause is written in a way that creates a unilateral obligation without corresponding consideration. That's not just bad business. In Washington state, it might not even be enforceable. Richard Hartley stepped forward now, his earlier amusement replaced by something harder. Victoria, this is ridiculous. The man probably took a paralegal class at community college and now thinks he understands corporate law. We have an entire legal team that's reviewed these documents. Martin didn't react to the condescension. He simply looked at Victoria and said, Ma'am, if you sign that contract as written, you're accepting terms that weren't in your original agreement. Someone at Prescott and Associates either made a significant error, or they're testing to see if you'll notice the change. Victoria's jaw tightened. She looked down at the contract in her hands, then back at Martin, and for the first time since he'd entered the building, he saw something crack in her facade of absolute confidence. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you, a delivery driver, spotted a legal discrepancy that my 30-person legal department somehow missed?" Martin said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, the kind sold at drugstores in 3-packs. He put them on carefully and held out his hand. "May I see the full contract?" Victoria's expression had moved beyond irritation into a territory that bordered on fascination or fury. It was impossible to tell which. She handed him the entire document with a sharp gesture. "Fine. Since you seem to think you're qualified to review corporate merger agreements, please, enlighten us all." Martin took the papers to a nearby bench against the wall and sat down slowly, as if his knees hurt from standing all day. The executives watched him with a mixture of disbelief and voyeuristic curiosity, the way people might watch a street performer attempting something that seemed impossible. He read in silence for nearly 3 minutes, his finger tracing lines of text, his lips occasionally moving as if sounding out particularly complex passages. Finally, he looked up and removed his glasses. "There are 4 substantive changes from standard merger language," he said. "The liability clause I mentioned. A modification to the termination provisions that gives Riverside unilateral exit rights without penalty. An arbitration clause that forces all disputes to be heard in Delaware instead of Washington, which strips your home court advantage. And a quiet little addition in the intellectual property section that grants Riverside licensing rights to any patents Sterling develops in the next 5 years, even if they're unrelated to the merger." The silence that followed was profound. Derek Walsh pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly. Richard Hartley's face had lost its smug assurance. And Victoria Chin looked as if someone had just told her that gravity might be optional. She walked over to Martin slowly, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. She took the contract from his hands and read through it again, this time with the intensity of someone searching for a bomb they now believed might actually be there. Her fingers stopped on the same sections Martin had identified. Her breathing changed. When she looked up, her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "Get Jonathan Prescott on the phone," she said to the receptionist, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Right now. I don't care if he's in surgery or meeting the president. Get him on the line in the next 60 seconds or find someone else at that firm who can explain to me why a delivery driver knows more about my own contract than the lawyers I'm paying $500 an hour." She turned back to Martin, and now there was something different in her eyes. Not quite respect yet, but the beginning of recognition that she'd made a significant miscalculation. "Who are you?" she asked simply. Martin stood up slowly, folding the reading glasses and putting them back in his pocket. "My name is Martin Torres. I deliver legal documents for Quick Serve Courier. I'm 53 years old. I've been doing this job for about 7 years now." "That's not what I'm asking," Victoria said. "How do you know contract law?" Martin picked up his delivery bag and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. The receptionist was speaking urgently into her phone, and Derek Walsh was now openly scrolling through what appeared to be legal databases on his tablet. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. "I used to practice law," Martin said quietly. "Corporate mergers and acquisitions, mostly. Mid-sized firms, nothing as prestigious as Prescott and Associates, but I did good work. Had my own practice for about 15 years. Victoria crossed her arms. "What happened?" Martin's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew distant, as if he were looking at a place that existed only in memory. "My wife got sick. Cancer. The aggressive kind that moves fast and costs more than insurance wants to cover. I liquidated the practice to pay for treatment. Experimental therapies, clinical trials, specialists who might have had answers the local hospitals didn't. She died anyway. Took about 18 months from diagnosis to the end." The executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard Hartley looked away toward the windows. Victoria's arms loosened slightly, though her posture remained rigid. After she was gone, Martin continued, his voice steady but quiet. "I had about $40,000 in debt, no practice, and a daughter who was 14 years old and grieving her mother while watching her father fall apart. I couldn't get back into law. Too much time away, too many burned bridges from canceling on clients during the worst of my wife's illness, and honestly, I didn't have the stomach for it anymore. Every contract felt like a countdown to another catastrophe I couldn't prevent. So I found work that let me pay bills and be home for my daughter in the evenings. Delivery seemed simple. Show up, carry things, collect signatures, go home. Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then back at Martin. "Jonathan Prescott is on the line," she said. "He wants to know what the emergency is." Martin picked up his signature pad. "You should tell him that someone in his office either made 4 critical errors in your contract amendments, or someone intentionally tried to slip disadvantageous terms past you hoping you wouldn't read carefully. Either way, you should probably not sign anything until you have independent counsel review every word." Victoria looked at the phone in her hand, then at the contract, then at Martin standing there in his faded uniform with his battered delivery bag. She made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that successful people learn to make quickly when new information renders old assumptions obsolete. "Stay," she said. It wasn't a request. Martin hesitated. "Ma'am, I have other deliveries." "I'll call your supervisor," Victoria said. "You're consulting on a legal matter for Sterling Industries. I'll make sure you're compensated for your time. But I want you here when I talk to Prescott." She walked into the conference room without waiting for an answer, her phone already at her ear, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to make someone's day significantly worse. The other executives followed her like pilot fish following a shark, except for Richard Hartley, who paused in the doorway and looked back at Martin. "That was impressive," Richard said quietly. "Or lucky. I haven't decided which." Martin smiled faintly. "Sometimes the difference matters less than the outcome." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You said you practiced for 15 years. Who did you work for?" Martin adjusted his glasses. "Started at Feldman and Wright in Portland. Then Chen Associates in San Francisco. Opened my own practice in Tacoma in 2008. Torres Legal Group. Specialized in mid-market mergers, mostly tech companies buying or being bought by larger firms." Richard's eyebrows rose. "You worked for Chen Associates? As in David Chen?" Martin nodded. "For about 5 years. Good man. Taught me more about reading between the lines of contracts than law school ever did." "David Chen is Victoria's uncle," Richard said slowly. "He's the one who convinced her to get into corporate law in the first place." Martin said nothing, but something flickered across his face that might have been irony or might have been simple acknowledgement that the universe had a complicated sense of humor. Through the glass walls of the conference room, they could see Victoria pacing like a caged wolf, her voice rising and falling in waves of controlled fury as she spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. The receptionist appeared at Martin's elbow, her earlier dismissiveness completely evaporated. "Miss Chen asked me to get you coffee or water. Can I bring you anything?" "Water would be fine," Martin said. "Thank you." As the receptionist hurried away, Martin walked to the windows and looked out at Seattle stretched below, the city where he'd once had ambitions that reached higher than the Space Needle. He'd forgotten what it felt like to use the part of his brain that could dissect legal language and spot the traps hidden in subordinate clauses. For 7 years, he'd been content to let that part of himself atrophy, to be just a man with a delivery route and a daughter to support. But standing here now, with the weight of his old expertise settling back onto his shoulders like a coat he'd forgotten he owned, Martin realized that some things don't die just because you stop using them. They wait. They're patient. And sometimes, they come back exactly when you need them most, or when someone else does. The conference room had transformed from a space of polished confidence into something closer to a war room. Victoria Chen stood at the head of the table, her phone on speaker, her voice cutting through the air like a surgical instrument designed for maximum precision and minimum mercy. Jonathan Prescott's voice crackled through the speaker with the defensive tone of a man who'd been pulled from something important and wasn't yet sure whether he should be apologetic or annoyed. "Jonathan," Victoria said, her fingers pressed flat against the obsidian surface of the table, I'm looking at Section 3, Subsection B of the merger amendments you sent over. Can you explain to me why the mutual indemnification clause from our original agreement has been replaced with unilateral liability on Sterling's part? There was a pause, the kind that gets longer the more guilty someone feels. Jonathan's voice, when it came back, had shifted into a register that lawyers use when they're buying time to formulate an answer that isn't technically a lie. Victoria, I'd need to pull up the file to give you specifics, but I'm confident that any modifications were discussed with your team during the revision process. My team, Victoria repeated slowly, never approved shifting full merger liability to Sterling Industries. And that's just the first problem I found. Want to hear the others, or should I have my Attorney General send you a formal list with a notice that we're reconsidering our relationship with Prescott and Associates entirely? Martin stood near the windows, water glass in hand, watching the interaction with the detached interest of someone who'd been in enough conference rooms to know that this conversation would follow a predictable arc: denial, deflection, grudging acknowledgement, and finally either genuine contrition or calculated damage control disguised as contrition. The receptionist had brought him a chair, which he'd politely declined. 7 years of delivery work had taught him that sitting down during business hours felt wrong, like a soldier relaxing at his post. Richard Hartley sat at the far end of the table, his tablet open in front of him, his fingers moving across the screen as he cross-referenced documents with the focused intensity of someone who'd just realized that a significant mistake had nearly cost his company millions. Derek Walsh had disappeared entirely, presumably to alert other departments that the Riverside merger was now on hold pending a complete legal review. Jonathan Prescott's voice had taken on a more careful quality now, the verbal equivalent of walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Victoria, I want to assure you that Prescott and Associates has your best interests at heart. If there have been miscommunications or unintended modifications to the contract language, we will absolutely address them immediately. Why don't we schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning where we can go through everything line by line? Tomorrow morning, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a temperature that could preserve biological samples indefinitely, is when I was supposed to sign these documents and announce the merger to the board. Instead, I'm now looking at a contract that would have exposed Sterling Industries to unlimited liability, stripped us of termination rights, forced us into arbitration in a jurisdiction 3,000 miles away, and granted Riverside licensing rights to intellectual property they had no business touching. So no, Jonathan, we're not scheduling a friendly meeting tomorrow morning. You're going to explain to me right now how 4 substantive changes that benefit the other party and harm mine made it into a document that your firm was hired to protect my interests in preparing. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Victoria glanced at her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Jonathan spoke again, his voice had shed all pretense of casual confidence. I need to make some internal inquiries. Can you give me 30 minutes? You have 15, Victoria said, and disconnected the call. She turned to look at Martin, who was still standing by the windows with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting. The rain had intensified, turning the city beyond the glass into an impressionist painting of gray and silver, buildings dissolving into weather until it was hard to tell where architecture ended and atmosphere began. Mr. Torres, Victoria said, and there was something different in her voice now, something that acknowledged she was speaking to a person rather than an interruption in her schedule. I owe you an apology. Martin set his water glass down on a nearby credenza. No ma'am, you don't. You reacted the way most people would when someone in a delivery uniform starts offering legal advice. The world teaches us to trust credentials and presentation over substance. That's not your fault. It's exactly my fault, Victoria countered. I built my career on the principle that details matter, that assumptions are dangerous, and that you verify everything before you sign. And today I was about to put my signature on a document I'd barely glanced at because I was too busy, too confident in my legal team, and too quick to dismiss someone based on how they looked rather than what they knew. Richard Hartley cleared his throat from his position at the table. Victoria, to be fair, none of us caught it either. If Torres hadn't been here, we'd all be celebrating a merger right now that would have destroyed this company within a year. Martin shook his head slightly. Someone would have caught it eventually. These things have a way of surfacing. Not before the contract was executed, Richard said. Once those signatures are in place, you're locked in. Best case scenario, we'd have spent the next 2 years in litigation trying to prove the terms were unconscionable. Worst case, Riverside would have systematically exploited every advantage they'd written into the agreement while we bled money trying to exit the deal. Victoria walked over to where Martin stood and looked out at the rain-soaked city beside him. When she spoke, her voice had lost its edge of command and taken on something more contemplative. My Uncle David used to tell me that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation is when you think you've won. He said that's when people stop paying attention, when they trust too much and verify too little. I thought I understood what he meant. But understanding something intellectually and having it demonstrated in a way that could have cost you everything, those are different kinds of knowledge. David Chin is a wise man, Martin said quietly. He taught me to read every contract as if the other party was trying to hide something, not because they necessarily were, but because that level of attention is the only way to be sure. Victoria turned to face him fully. How long did you work for my uncle? 5 years, Martin said. 2003 to 2008. He hired me right out of a smaller firm where I'd been doing mostly real estate transactions. Said he saw something in the way I approached documents, some kind of paranoid attention to detail that most lawyers either don't have or train themselves out of because it takes too much time. He built an entire department around that philosophy. Read everything twice, trust nothing, assume every contract is a puzzle where someone's hidden the trap. I never knew him to mentor people, Victoria said. He was always too busy building the firm. He made time, Martin replied. Usually late at night after everyone else had gone home. He'd pull out contracts from old cases and walk me through them, showing me where clients had tried to slip things past him, where opposing counsel had buried clauses in subsections, where the real power dynamics of a deal were hidden in the passive voice and conditional language. He called it learning to hear what contracts weren't saying out loud. The phone on the conference table buzzed. Victoria glanced at it, then back at Martin. That's probably Prescott calling back. Before I take it, I need to know something. When you read that contract, how long did it take you to spot the problems? Martin considered the question. The liability clause jumped out immediately. It's phrased in a way that sounds mutual until you realize one party is holding all the obligation. The other 3 took a few minutes. But I wasn't reading casually. I was reading the way your uncle taught me to read, with the assumption that something was wrong and I just hadn't found it yet. And if you hadn't been reading that way, Victoria asked. If you'd just been doing your job as a delivery driver and left the envelope without question, then you'd have signed it, Martin said simply. And 6 months from now when the first liability issue arose, or when Riverside exercised their termination rights without cause, or when you discovered they'd claimed licensing rights to your patents, you'd have been trapped in a merger that was designed to benefit them at every turn. Eventually you'd have figured it out, but by then the damage would have been done. Richard stood up from the table and walked over to join them at the windows. Torres, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to know I'm asking seriously, not as an insult or a joke. What the hell are you doing delivering packages? Martin smiled faintly. Paying my bills. Supporting my daughter. Living a life that doesn't require me to think about worst-case scenarios every waking hour. That's not an answer, Richard pressed. You clearly still have the skills. Why aren't you practicing? Because practicing law isn't just about having skills, Martin said, his voice patient. It's about having the stamina for fights that never really end, the emotional capacity to care deeply about other people's problems while maintaining enough distance not to drown in them, and the professional network to generate clients who trust you with their futures. I lost all of that when my wife got sick. Not just the skills, but the architecture around the skills that makes them useful. And honestly, I'm not sure I want it back. The phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. Victoria picked it up, glanced at the screen, and held up one finger in a gesture that asked for another moment. She looked at Martin with an expression that was harder to read than any contract clause. If I asked you to stay past today, not just for this conversation but to review the rest of our merger documents, would you consider it? Martin shifted his delivery bag on his shoulder. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not a consultant. I'm a delivery driver who happens to remember some things from a previous life. You have an entire legal department. Once they know what to look for, they'll find anything else that's problematic." "Our entire legal department missed this," Victoria said. "You didn't. That suggests either we have the wrong legal department, or you have capabilities they lack. I'm inclined to think it's the latter." Before Martin could respond, the phone buzzed a third time and Victoria answered it, putting it on speaker. Jonathan Prescott's voice filled the room, and this time there was no attempt at casual confidence or defensive positioning. "Victoria, I've completed my internal review and I owe you a complete and unconditional apology." "Go on," Victoria said, her voice neutral. "The contract modifications were made by one of our junior partners, a man named Garrett Simmons, who was apparently operating under the misguided belief that he was optimizing the language for efficiency. He made the changes without supervisory approval and without consulting your team because he thought, and I'm quoting from his explanation here, that the original terms were too favorable to Sterling and needed to be balanced. He has been suspended pending a full ethics review, and I want to assure you that this does not represent the standards or practices of Prescott and Associates." Victoria's jaw tightened. Garrett Simmons made 4 substantive changes to a multi-million-dollar merger agreement because he personally felt our terms were too favorable. And no one caught it before the documents were sent to me for signature. There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "We had a breakdown in our review process. The senior partner who should have signed off on the amendments was out for a family emergency, and Simmons apparently decided to expedite the delivery rather than wait for proper authorization. It's inexcusable and we take full responsibility." Richard leaned forward. "Jonathan, this is Richard Hartley. I need to understand something. If these documents had been signed as written, what would Sterling's legal position have been?" Another pause. "If we're being completely honest, Richard, your position would have been severely compromised. The liability modification alone would have exposed Sterling to potential losses in the tens of millions. The intellectual property clause would have granted Riverside access to patents and innovations well beyond the scope of the merger. And the arbitration provision would have made it extremely difficult and expensive to challenge any of these terms in court. In short, it would have been a catastrophic agreement for Sterling to enter into." "And yet," Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet, "these documents left your office with your firm's letterhead, your partner's signature, and every appearance of being legitimate contract amendments that I should sign without question. Victoria, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. We will of course be issuing a full replacement set of amendments that restore all original terms, and I would like to discuss what appropriate compensation we can provide for this serious error." "We'll discuss compensation later," Victoria said. "Right now I want those corrected amendments delivered to me by end of business today, and I want them reviewed by someone other than anyone in your firm. I want independent counsel to verify that every word matches our original agreement. And Jonathan, if I find one more discrepancy, one more modification that wasn't explicitly approved, Prescott and Associates will never work with Sterling Industries again. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear. You'll have the corrected documents within 3 hours." Victoria ended the call and stood in silence for a long moment, her hands flat on the table, her breathing carefully controlled. When she looked up, her eyes found Martin's. 3 hours ago I thought I understood how this business worked. Now I'm questioning whether I understand anything at all." "You understand plenty," Martin said. "You caught the problem once it was pointed out. You took immediate action. And you're making sure it doesn't happen again. That's not failure. That's adaptation. You only pointed it out because you happened to notice a broken seal," Victoria said. "What if you hadn't? What if you'd just handed me the envelope and left like any other delivery driver would have done?" Martin picked up his water glass and finished what remained. "Then you'd have learned a very expensive lesson about trust and verification. But you didn't, because sometimes the universe puts the right person in the right place at exactly the right time, and wisdom is recognizing that moment when it arrives instead of dismissing it because it doesn't look how you expected. Derek Walsh appeared in the doorway, his phone in hand, his expression somewhere between relief and residual panic. "I've notified the board that the merger signing is postponed pending legal review. They're not happy about the delay, but they're a lot happier than they'd be if we'd discovered this after execution." "Good," Victoria said. "Get our internal legal team together. I want every document related to the Riverside merger reviewed by end of week. Every contract, every amendment, every piece of correspondence. If there are any other surprises hiding in the language, I want them found before we move forward." Derek nodded and disappeared back into the hallway. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the building below, people were going about their ordinary work, unaware that a disaster had been narrowly avoided by a man in a delivery uniform who'd taken the time to notice that something wasn't quite right. Richard walked over to the coffee station in the corner and poured himself a cup, his movements slow and deliberate. "Torres," he said without turning around, "I'm going to make the same offer Victoria made, but I'm going to frame it differently. We need someone who reads contracts the way you do. Not full-time necessarily, but as a consultant we can call when we need a second set of eyes on critical documents. Name your rate and your schedule. We'll make it work." Martin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of a decision he'd clearly been avoiding for a long time. "Mr. Hartley, 7 years ago I made a choice to step away from this world because being in it hurt too much. Every contract reminded me of what I'd lost, every negotiation felt like a countdown to another catastrophe I wouldn't be able to prevent. And I know that sounds dramatic, but grief makes everything dramatic, especially in the beginning. I'm not sure I'm ready to come back to it, even part-time." "Fair enough," Richard said, turning to face him. "But answer me this. When you read that contract today, did it hurt? Or did it feel like remembering something important about yourself that you'd forgotten?" Martin met his eyes and didn't answer immediately. The truth was more complicated than either option Richard had presented. Reading the contract had felt like visiting a house where he'd once lived, recognizing the rooms and the layout but knowing he didn't live there anymore. There was familiarity and loss in something else too, something that felt like competence remembered, like the satisfaction of solving a puzzle that most people couldn't see was even there. "It felt," Martin said finally, "like being useful in a way I haven't been for a very long time. And I'm not sure yet whether that's something I want more of or something I should be careful about wanting at all." Victoria's phone buzzed again, and this time she silenced it without looking. "Mr. Torres, I'm not going to pressure you for an answer today. But I am going to have my assistant take your contact information, and I'm going to send you a consulting agreement that pays you $500 an hour for contract review work, with a minimum billable increment of 1 hour. It'll be waiting in your email by tomorrow morning. If you decide you want to look at it, look at it. If you decide to sign it, sign it. And if you decide to throw it away and keep delivering packages, I'll respect that decision and remain grateful that you were here today when I needed someone to see what I was missing." Martin adjusted his delivery bag one more time, a gesture that had become habitual over 7 years of carrying weight from place to place. "I should get back to my route. My supervisor's probably wondering why I've been at one stop for over an hour." "I called your supervisor," Victoria said. "Told him you were consulting on a legal matter and that Sterling Industries would be compensating both you and QuickServe for your time today. He was very understanding once I mentioned the compensation part." Martin allowed himself a small smile. "Then I suppose I should finish this delivery properly and be on my way." He walked to the reception desk where his signature pad was still sitting, picked it up, and checked his delivery log. Victoria Chen had signed for the package almost an hour ago, but protocol required him to make a note about the circumstances of delivery whenever something unusual occurred. He typed briefly into the device, noting that the seal had been compromised and that the recipient had been advised. Then he filed the delivery as complete and slipped the device back into his bag. When he turned around, Victoria was standing right behind him, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of long hours and difficult decisions, and something else too, something that looked like respect earned rather than given by default. "Thank you," she said simply. "For paying attention when you didn't have to. For speaking up when it would have been easier to stay silent. And for reminding me that wisdom doesn't always arrive wearing the right credentials. Martin nodded once. Good luck with your merger, Ms. Chen. And if I might offer one last piece of unsolicited advice, when you get those corrected documents, read them yourself before anyone else does. Don't rely on your legal team, don't trust that everything's been fixed, just read every word with fresh eyes. Your uncle taught me that the only person you can truly rely on to protect your interests is yourself. Everyone else, no matter how skilled or well-intentioned, is operating from a position of partial investment. You're the only one who'll lose everything if something goes wrong, so you're the only one who should have final say on whether the language is acceptable. Victoria absorbed this quietly. I'll do that. And Mr. Torres, I meant what I said about the consulting agreement. Think about it. I will, Martin said, though they both knew he probably wouldn't, or at least wouldn't let himself think about it seriously enough to risk reopening doors he'd carefully closed 7 years ago. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited as the machinery hummed somewhere in the walls. The doors opened with a soft chime that seemed too cheerful for the weight of the afternoon's revelations. He stepped inside and turned to face the closing doors, catching one last glimpse of the executive suite where Victoria Chen still stood by the reception desk, her phone in hand, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was reconsidering not just the contract but perhaps her entire approach to verification and trust. The elevator descended 42 floors in smooth silence, counting down through the building's vertical architecture like a regression through altitude and aspiration. When the doors opened onto the ground floor lobby, Martin stepped out into a world that felt simultaneously exactly the same and subtly different from the one he'd entered 90 minutes earlier. The rain was still falling. His delivery bag still weighed the same. His route still had 3 more stops before he could pick up his daughter's medication and head home to the small apartment they'd shared since everything had fallen apart. But something had shifted, some internal mechanism had been jarred back into motion by the act of using skills he thought were atrophied beyond recovery. And as Martin pushed through the revolving doors into the wet embrace of a Seattle afternoon, he wondered if maybe Richard Hartley had been right to ask that question, not whether the work would hurt but whether remembering competence felt like coming home or like visiting a grave. The truth, Martin thought as he pulled his hood up against the rain and headed toward his delivery van parked 3 blocks away, was probably somewhere between those two options. Because most important truths weren't binary. They were complicated and contextual and changed depending on what day you asked the question and how recently you'd been reminded that the person you used to be was still there, waiting patiently beneath the uniform and the routine, ready to surface the moment someone needed what only you could offer. The rain had softened to a fine mist by the time Martin pulled his delivery van into the parking lot of Riverside Medical Plaza, his 3rd stop of the afternoon. The building was newer than most in this part of Seattle, all glass and brushed steel designed to convey both medical competence and corporate efficiency. He checked his manifest, confirmed the delivery details, and gathered 2 packages from the back of the van, both addressed to different offices within the same medical complex. His phone buzzed as he locked the van door. A text from his daughter Emma. "Dad, pharmacy called. They said insurance denied the prior auth again. Can you call them?" Martin felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Emma's medical needs collided with the baroque machinery of American healthcare. She'd been diagnosed with juvenile arthritis 3 years ago, the same autoimmune disorder that had taken her mother's sister at 42. The medication that kept Emma's joints from deteriorating cost $3,200 a month without insurance, and lately the insurance company had discovered new and creative reasons to deny coverage every few months, forcing Martin into a cycle of appeals and phone calls that felt designed to exhaust people into giving up. He typed back quickly. "I'll handle it. Don't worry. How was school?" The response came almost immediately. "Fine. History test was easy. When will you be home?" 6:30 at the latest, Martin replied. "Want me to pick up Thai food?" "Yes please. Extra spring rolls." Martin pocketed his phone and headed toward the Medical Plaza entrance, the packages tucked under one arm. The lobby smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, that particular combination of cleanliness and sterility that all medical buildings seem to share regardless of their architecture or intended purpose. A directory on the wall listed dozens of practices, specialists arranged alphabetically like a taxonomy of human fragility. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, delivered the first package to a dermatology practice without incident, then headed down the hall toward the second delivery destination, an office suite labeled Sterling Medical Consulting. The name registered dimly in Martin's mind, some echo of the morning's encounter still reverberating, but he dismissed it as coincidence. Sterling wasn't an uncommon name in corporate Seattle. The reception area was empty except for a young woman behind the desk who looked up from her computer with the practiced smile of someone trained to greet strangers warmly regardless of what chaos might be unfolding behind the scenes. Martin approached, set down the package, and pulled out his signature pad. "Delivery for Dr. Patricia Sterling," he said. The receptionist reached for the package, then paused as her phone lit up with an internal line. She held up one finger in apology and answered. "Dr. Sterling's office," she said, then listened for a moment. Her expression shifted from professional courtesy to something more complex. "Yes, he's here right now actually. I can ask." She put the call on hold and looked at Martin with an expression that suggested she was about to make a request that fell outside standard protocol. "Mr. Torres, is it? Dr. Sterling would like to speak with you if you have a moment. She says it's important." Martin frowned slightly. "I'm just here to deliver a package, ma'am. I don't usually meet with recipients unless there's a problem with the delivery." "She says she knows you," the receptionist replied. "Or rather, she knows of you. She heard about what happened at Sterling Industries this morning." The connection clicked into place in Martin's mind like a tumbler falling in a lock. Patricia Sterling, Victoria Chen's sister-in-law perhaps, or cousin, some branch of the family tree that extended into medicine rather than corporate law. He considered declining, continuing with his route, maintaining the boundary between his current life and the world he'd left behind. But something in the receptionist's expression suggested this wasn't a casual request, and Martin had learned during his years practicing law that when important people wanted to talk to you, declining without hearing them out first was rarely wise. "I can spare a few minutes," he said. The receptionist smiled with genuine relief and gestured toward a hallway to her left. "Last door on the right. She's expecting you." Martin walked down the corridor, his boots quiet on carpet that absorbed sound like it was designed to prevent any noise from carrying between rooms. Medical offices always felt like that to him, spaces engineered for privacy and contained suffering, where conversations about mortality and treatment options happened behind closed doors and nobody in the waiting room had to hear the details of how fragile human bodies really were. The last door on the right stood slightly ajar. Martin knocked lightly on the frame and a voice from inside called for him to enter. He stepped into an office that managed to feel both professional and personal, diplomas and certifications on one wall, family photos on another, and a desk covered in neat stacks of files that suggested someone who dealt in complexity but refused to let it become chaos. Dr. Patricia Sterling stood as he entered, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair cut short and eyes that carried the particular kind of intelligence that comes from spending decades translating medical science into language that terrified patients could understand. She wore a white coat over dark slacks and a blue blouse, and her handshake when she offered it was firm without being aggressive. "Mr. Torres, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this is irregular." Martin set his delivery bag on the floor beside a chair and remained standing. "Ma'am, I'm not entirely sure why I'm here. Your receptionist said you'd heard about something that happened this morning." Patricia gestured for him to sit and moved back behind her desk. "Victoria Chen is my sister," she said simply. "She called me about 2 hours ago, extremely agitated, talking about a delivery driver who'd saved her company from a catastrophic merger agreement. She gave me your name and asked if I knew you. When I told her I didn't, she asked me to try to speak with you if you happen to make any deliveries to this building. She seemed to think it was urgent." Martin sat slowly, processing this information. "Your sister is persistent." "My sister," Patricia said with a slight smile, "is terrified. Not of losing money or reputation, though both are certainly concerns. She's terrified that she nearly made a decision that would have destroyed everything she'd built, and she only avoided it because someone she'd initially dismissed as irrelevant happened to pay closer attention than she did. That's not the kind of experience Victoria processes easily. She's spent her entire career being the smartest person in every room she enters. Having that assumption challenged by someone in a delivery uniform has fundamentally unsettled her worldview. Martin shifted in his chair. Dr. Sterling, I appreciate you taking the time to explain this, but I'm still not clear on why you wanted to speak with me specifically. If your sister wants to follow up, she has my contact information through my employer. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. Mr. Torres, Victoria told me about your background. She mentioned that you'd worked for our Uncle David, that you'd practiced merger and acquisition law, and that you'd left the profession after your wife became ill. She also mentioned, though perhaps she shouldn't have, that you'd spent everything you had trying to save her and that you'd been working as a delivery driver ever since. Martin's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened slightly. That's personal information she had no business sharing. You're absolutely right, Patricia said. And I told her exactly that. But she shared it with me because she wanted my perspective on something, and now I'd like to share that perspective with you if you'll allow it. Martin waited, saying nothing. Patricia opened one of the folders on her desk and pulled out a photograph, turning it so Martin could see. It showed a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held the particular kind of sadness that children shouldn't have to carry. This is my daughter Rachel, Patricia said quietly. She died 11 years ago. Brain cancer. We tried everything, every treatment, every clinical trial, every specialist who might have had an answer we hadn't thought of yet. I'm a doctor, Mr. Torres. I have access to medical knowledge and professional networks that most people don't. And none of it mattered. She died anyway. I'm sorry for your loss, Martin said, and meant it. After Rachel passed, Patricia continued, I couldn't practice medicine for almost 2 years. Every patient became my daughter. Every diagnosis felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. I took a leave of absence, spent time in therapy, and eventually found my way to medical consulting, which lets me use my knowledge without having to be present for the emotional weight of ongoing patient care. It's not the same as practicing, but it allows me to contribute without drowning. Martin understood where this was going now, could see the architecture of the conversation Patricia was building. You're telling me this because your sister thinks I'm making the same mistake you did, stepping away from something I'm skilled at because the emotional cost feels too high. Patricia closed the folder gently. I'm telling you this because when Victoria described you this afternoon, the way you read that contract, the precision of your analysis, the fact that you spotted problems her entire legal team had missed, she said you looked different while you were doing it. She said you stopped being a man trying to be invisible and became someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. And then the moment the crisis was over, you picked up your delivery bag and tried to disappear again. Martin stood up slowly. Dr. Sterling, I appreciate what you're trying to do here. But my situation isn't the same as yours. You found a way to stay in medicine by changing how you practiced. I left law entirely because staying in it, in any capacity, was a reminder of everything I'd lost. That's not weakness or avoidance. It's survival. Is it though? Patricia asked gently. Or is it just a different kind of dying? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Martin picked up his delivery bag and adjusted the strap over his shoulder, the gesture automatic now after 7 years of repetition. I should get back to my route. Before you go, Patricia said, standing as well. There's something else Victoria asked me to mention. She's drafting a consulting agreement for you, something flexible that would let you review contracts on your own schedule without any obligation to take on more than you're comfortable with. She wanted me to tell you that if the emotional weight of legal work is what's keeping you away, she's willing to structure the arrangement so you never have to interact with clients directly, never have to be present for negotiations or closings, never have to be in the room when decisions are made. Just you and documents, using your skills without the surrounding architecture that makes it feel like practicing law. Martin paused at the door. "And what did you tell her when she asked you to pass along that message?" "I told her," Patricia said, "that it was a good offer but that ultimately you'd have to decide for yourself whether using your skills again would feel like coming back to life or like reopening a wound that had finally started to heal. I also told her that sometimes those two things aren't mutually exclusive, that healing and hurting can happen simultaneously, and that the question isn't whether something will be difficult but whether it will be worthwhile." Martin looked at the photograph of Rachel still visible on Patricia's desk, a child frozen forever at an age she'd never grow beyond. "Did you ever regret leaving direct patient care?" he asked quietly. "Even after you found consulting work that felt sustainable, did you ever wish you'd found a way to stay in the room with patients?" "Every single day," Patricia said without hesitation. "But I also know that if I'd forced myself to stay in direct practice, I would have burned out completely within a year and left medicine entirely. Consulting isn't what I wanted. It's what I could manage. And over time, I've learned that being useful in a limited capacity is better than being absent entirely." Martin nodded slowly. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Sterling. And please tell your sister that I'll think about her offer." He walked back down the hallway, past the reception desk where the young woman was now on the phone with someone else, and out into the medical plaza corridor where the fluorescent lighting made everything look slightly less real than it should. His phone buzzed again as he waited for the elevator. Another text from Emma. "Dad, I forgot to tell you, Mrs. Chen called looking for you. She said she's Victoria Chen's assistant and that Ms. Chen wanted to confirm your contact information. I gave her your email. Hope that's okay?" Martin stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. "That's fine. See you tonight." The elevator doors opened and he stepped inside, watching his reflection in the polished steel as the mechanism carried him back down through the building's vertical layers. He looked tired, he realized. Not just the physical exhaustion of a long day on his feet, but the deeper weariness that comes from holding parts of yourself in suspension for so long that you forget what it feels like to be whole. His next delivery was to a law office downtown, which struck him as either cosmically ironic or simply the universe's way of making sure he couldn't escape certain themes no matter how hard he tried. The building was older than Sterling Industries' headquarters, one of those pre-war structures with marble lobbies and brass fixtures that spoke to an era when architectural gravitas was considered essential for professional credibility. The law firm occupied 3 floors near the top, and Martin rode the elevator up while mentally reviewing what he needed to do after his route was finished. Call the pharmacy about Emma's medication. Call the insurance company to appeal the denial, again. Pick up Thai food on the way home. Help Emma with her homework if she needed it, though at 15 she rarely did anymore. Try not to think about the fact that Victoria Chen's offer was probably sitting in his email inbox by now, waiting for him to either open it or delete it unread. The law firm's reception area was exactly what he'd expected, all dark wood and leather furniture and walls lined with books that were probably more decorative than functional in an age when legal research happened on computers. The receptionist took his delivery, signed for it efficiently, and Martin was back in the elevator within 2 minutes, grateful for interactions that remained transactional and uncomplicated. His phone rang as he stepped out into the lobby. Unknown number, Seattle area code. He almost didn't answer, but something made him accept the call. "Martin Torres," he said. "Mr. Torres, this is Jennifer Park from Pacific Northwest Insurance. I'm calling about the prior authorization appeal for Emma Torres's prescription for adalimumab. I wanted to let you know that we've reviewed the case and we're prepared to approve coverage for the next 6 months." Martin stopped walking, standing in the middle of the marble lobby while people flowed around him like water around a stone. "You're approving it? Just like that?" "Well," Jennifer said, and there was something careful in her tone, "we received some additional documentation from Emma's rheumatologist this afternoon that clarified the medical necessity. The appeal looked much stronger with that supporting evidence, so we were able to fast-track the approval." Martin's mind worked through the implications. Emma's rheumatologist was Dr. Sarah Winters, a competent physician but not someone who typically went out of her way to provide additional documentation unless specifically requested. And Martin hadn't requested anything because the denial had only happened this morning. Ms. Park, Martin said slowly, can you tell me what time this additional documentation was submitted? There was a pause, the sound of keyboard keys clicking. Let me see. It looks like it came through at 1:47 p.m. today. 1:47. Less than an hour after Martin had left Sterling Industries. He closed his eyes briefly, understanding now that Victoria Chen's persistence extended beyond drafting consulting agreements. She'd somehow found out about Emma's medication situation, probably through the same casual invasion of privacy that had led her to tell Patricia about his background, and she'd apparently decided that getting his daughter's prescription approved was an appropriate way to demonstrate gratitude. Thank you for letting me know, Martin said. I appreciate the fast turnaround. You're very welcome. You should be able to pick up the medication tomorrow. Have a good evening. Martin ended the call and stood in the lobby for another moment, trying to decide how he felt about this development. Grateful certainly, because Emma's medication was expensive and essential. Uncomfortable also, because accepting help from someone he'd met only hours ago created an obligation he wasn't sure he wanted. And underneath both of those reactions, something else, a recognition that Victoria Chen understood leverage and motivation in ways that made her very good at her job and very difficult to maintain boundaries with. He finished his route by 5:30, returned the van to the quick-serve depot, clocked out, and drove his personal car to the pharmacy. The prescription was ready, just as Jennifer Park had promised, and when the pharmacist rang it up, the copay was $15 instead of the $300 it had been last month when the insurance had only partially covered it. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table when Martin got home, her laptop open beside her textbook, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than 15. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up in a way that still made his chest ache with the knowledge that she'd never smile at her mother like that again. Did you get the medication? She asked. Martin set the pharmacy bag on the counter. Got it. Insurance approved it after all. Emma's eyebrows rose. Really? They never approve anything without making you fight for it first. Apparently your doctor sent them some additional information that convinced them, Martin said, which was technically true even if he suspected the doctor had sent that information at someone else's request. He ordered Thai food while Emma finished her homework, and they ate together at the kitchen table while she told him about her history test and a friend drama that seemed simultaneously urgent and incomprehensible to Martin's adult perspective. He listened carefully, asked questions when appropriate, and tried not to think about the email that was probably waiting in his inbox or the consulting agreement that Victoria Chen had promised would arrive by tomorrow morning. After Emma went to her room to video chat with friends, Martin finally opened his laptop and checked his email. The message from Victoria Chen's assistant was there, professional and brief. Mr. Torres, Ms. Chen asked me to forward you the attached consulting agreement for your review. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. She also wanted me to pass along that she's grateful for your assistance today and hopes you'll consider the opportunity. Martin opened the attachment and began to read. The agreement was exactly as Victoria had described it to Patricia: flexible scheduling, high hourly rate, no obligation to take on work he wasn't comfortable with, no client interaction required. Just document review, analysis, and written reports submitted remotely. It was structured in a way that acknowledged his skills while respecting his boundaries, and Martin recognized the care that had gone into drafting terms that would be difficult to refuse. He closed the laptop without responding and sat in the quiet apartment, listening to the distant sound of Emma laughing in her room, probably at something one of her friends had said. This was the life he'd built after everything had fallen apart. Modest, manageable, focused entirely on making sure his daughter had what she needed and didn't have to worry about whether her father was falling apart the way he had in those first terrible months after her mother died. But sitting there in the kitchen with the consulting agreement waiting for his response and the memory of how it had felt to read that contract this afternoon still fresh in his mind, Martin realized that Patricia Sterling had asked exactly the right question. Was this survival, or was it just a different kind of dying? Was he protecting himself by maintaining these boundaries, or was he preventing himself from becoming whole again by refusing to use the parts of himself that still worked? The answer, Martin suspected, wasn't simple. It probably wasn't even binary. but it was a question worth sitting with, worth considering honestly rather than dismissing out of defensive habit. And maybe that was enough for tonight. To acknowledge that the question existed, that it mattered, and that whatever decision he eventually made would be complicated and imperfect and entirely his own. Outside the apartment windows, Seattle continued its evening routine, traffic flowing like blood through the city's arterial streets, lights coming on in windows where other families were sharing meals and conversations, and the ordinary intimacy of domestic life. Martin sat in his kitchen and thought about contracts and consequences, about the difference between using your skills and rebuilding your life, about whether Victoria Chen's offer represented opportunity or obligation, and about the fact that sometimes the hardest decisions aren't between good and bad options but between different versions of good, each one carrying its own specific weight and promise. 3 days passed before Martin responded to Victoria Chen's email. 3 days of delivering packages, helping Emma with algebra homework, and lying awake at night thinking about what Patricia Sterling had said about healing and hurting happening simultaneously. On the fourth morning, he sat down at his kitchen table before his shift started and typed a brief message. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed the consulting agreement. I'm willing to accept on a trial basis for 3 months. After that period, we can both reassess whether the arrangement is working. Please let me know the next steps. He sent the email before he could reconsider, then left for work with the feeling that he'd just stepped off a ledge without knowing how far the drop was or what he'd land on. The response came before lunch. Mr. Torres, excellent news. I'm forwarding you 3 contracts that need review by end of week. No rush beyond that deadline. Take whatever time you need to do thorough work. We'll discuss your findings next Monday if that works with your schedule. The contracts arrived as attachments in a separate email 20 minutes later. Martin downloaded them to his laptop during his lunch break, sitting in his van in a parking lot while rain drummed on the metal roof. He opened the first document and began to read, and within minutes he felt that shift happening again, the one Victoria had apparently noticed, where some dormant part of his brain woke up and started working at full capacity. The first contract was a software licensing agreement between Sterling Industries and a company called Datacore Solutions. Standard terms mostly, but Martin noticed immediately that the audit provisions were asymmetric. Sterling could audit Datacore's compliance with usage restrictions, but Datacore had no reciprocal right to verify Sterling's implementation of security protocols. That mattered because the software handled sensitive customer data, and without mutual audit rights, Sterling was taking on sole responsibility for any breaches without the ability to verify whether Datacore's software had vulnerabilities that contributed to security failures. He made notes in a separate document, flagging the issue with an explanation of why it created unnecessary risk exposure. Then he moved to the second contract, a commercial real estate lease for a warehouse facility in Tacoma. The lease term was standard, but the renewal options were written in a way that gave the landlord unilateral control over renewal pricing. Sterling could exercise the option to extend, but the landlord could set any rent increase they wanted, effectively making the renewal option meaningless if the landlord decided to price Sterling out of the space. More notes, more explanations of why language that seemed innocuous on first reading actually transferred power in ways that could become expensive problems down the line. The third contract took longer because it was a partnership agreement with multiple parties and complex revenue-sharing provisions that required Martin to diagram the payment waterfall on scratch paper to understand where money would actually flow under different scenarios. By the time he finished reviewing all 3 contracts, his lunch break had extended to 90 minutes and his supervisor had called twice wondering where he was. Martin returned to his route with apologies, completed his remaining deliveries, and spent that evening after Emma went to bed writing up his analysis in a format that was clear and actionable without being condescending. He submitted the report Friday morning with the same feeling of uncertainty he'd felt sending the initial acceptance email. This was work he used to do reflexively, analysis that would have taken him half the time back when his brain was trained for it, but even rusty and out of practice he could tell his observations were solid. The question was whether Victoria Chen would agree, or whether she'd expected something more polished from someone she was paying $500 an hour. The response came Saturday afternoon. Mr. Torres, your analysis is excellent. You caught issues our team missed and explained them in a way that makes the business implications crystal clear. I'm implementing your recommendations on all 3 contracts. Are you available for a brief call Monday morning to discuss next steps? They spoke Monday at 9, Martin taking the call from his van before his shift started. Victoria's voice on the phone was different from how she'd sounded in person, less controlled somehow, as if the distance of a phone call allowed her to be more direct. Torres, I'm not going to waste your time with pleasantries. Your work this week was exactly what I needed. I want to increase the volume of contracts I send you, but only if you're comfortable with that. I'm also curious whether you'd be open to occasionally attending meetings where contract terms are being negotiated, not as active counsel but as an observer who can flag issues in real time before they make it into written form. Martin watched rain streak down his windshield and considered how to answer honestly. Ms. Chen, the document review works for me because I can do it on my own schedule without being present for the emotional dynamics of negotiation. Sitting in meetings watching people fight over terms, that's closer to practicing law than I'm ready for. Fair enough, Victoria said. Document review only. But I want to be clear about something. You have a gift for this work, Torres. Not just the technical skill, which is excellent, but the ability to see second and third order consequences that most lawyers miss because they're too focused on the immediate transaction. I don't want to pressure you into something you're not ready for, but I also don't want you to underestimate what you're capable of or how valuable that capability is. I appreciate that, Martin said. And I'll keep doing the document review as long as it's working for both of us. But I need you to understand that this is as far as I can go right now. Maybe that changes eventually. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, I need you to respect that boundary. Understood, Victoria said. New contracts will be in your inbox by end of day. The rhythm established itself over the following weeks. Victoria would send contracts, Martin would review them in the evenings after Emma was asleep or during lunch breaks when his delivery route allowed for extended stops. The work was steady but not overwhelming, and the income made a difference in ways both practical and psychological. Martin paid down debt he'd been carrying for years. He took Emma to a nicer restaurant for her 16th birthday than he would have been able to afford otherwise. He replaced the tires on his car that had been worn past the point of safety. But more than the money, the work gave him something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. A sense of competence, of being useful in ways that required the full scope of his intelligence rather than just his ability to show up and follow routes. He started sleeping better. The constant low-grade anxiety that had become his baseline emotional state began to recede slightly, as if using his brain for complex analysis again had released some pressure valve he didn't know needed releasing. Emma noticed the change even if she didn't understand what caused it. "You seem happier lately," she said one evening while they were cooking dinner together. "Less stressed or something?" "Work's been good," Martin said, which was true even if it didn't capture the full complexity of what he was experiencing. "I picked up some consulting projects that are interesting." "Like what?" Emma asked, stirring pasta while Martin chopped vegetables. "Contract review," Martin said. "Remember how I used to be a lawyer before I started doing deliveries? A company hired me to look over their legal documents and make sure they're getting good deals." Emma looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "Does that mean you might go back to being a lawyer full-time?" Martin set down the knife and turned to face her fully. "No. This is just side work, something I do in addition to deliveries. It helps with bills and it's interesting, but it's not the same as practicing law. That's not something I'm ready to go back to." Emma nodded slowly, but something in her expression suggested she understood more than Martin had said aloud. "Mom would be happy you're using your lawyer brain again. She always said it was a waste when you stopped." The comment hit Martin like a physical thing, not painful exactly but weighted with implications he wasn't ready to examine. "Your mom wanted a lot of things," he said quietly. "But she also understood that people have to make choices based on what they can handle, not what they wish they could handle." They finished making dinner in comfortable silence, but Martin thought about Emma's words through the rest of the evening and into the night when he was alone with his laptop reviewing another contract Victoria had sent. His wife Clara would have been pleased he was using his skills again. She'd been devastated when he'd closed his practice, not because of the financial implications but because she'd known how much of his identity had been wrapped up in the work. She told him once, near the end when the morphine made her more honest and careful, that the worst part about dying wasn't leaving life but knowing that her death would take pieces of him with her that might never grow back. 2 months into the consulting arrangement, Victoria sent Martin a contract that was different from the others. It was an employment agreement for a senior executive Sterling Industries was trying to recruit from a competitor, and the terms were complex enough that Martin needed 3 evenings to work through all the implications. When he finally submitted his analysis, he included a note at the end. Ms. Chen, the compensation structure in this agreement is designed to look generous while actually being quite restrictive. The executive would be better served negotiating for different terms. I've outlined specific alternative language in the attached document. Victoria called him the next morning. Torres, I need you to explain something. The executive in question is considering this offer as one of 2 competing opportunities. If I implement your suggested changes, it makes our offer significantly more expensive and possibly less competitive with what the other company is proposing. Are you sure the changes are necessary? Martin had anticipated this question. The changes make your offer more expensive in the short term but more equitable in the long term. The way the agreement is currently written, the executive absorbs most of the risk if the role doesn't work out or if market conditions change. Your company keeps all the flexibility. That might be good for Sterling Industries, but it's not good for the executive, and eventually that inequity will create resentment and retention problems. So you're saying I should negotiate against my own company's interests, Victoria said, and there was something in her tone Martin couldn't quite identify. I'm saying you should structure agreements that are sustainable, Martin replied. You can win a negotiation in the short term by getting someone to accept unfavorable terms, but you lose in the long term when they realize they've been taken advantage of and either underperform or leave. Good contracts aren't about one party winning and the other losing. They're about creating terms both parties can live with over time. There was a long pause. Torres, do you realize you just gave me advice that will cost my company about $200,000 over the life of this employment agreement? Yes, Martin said. Do you want me to change my recommendation? No, Victoria said, and now Martin could identify the tone in her voice. It was respect, genuine and hard-earned. I want you to keep doing exactly what you're doing, which is apparently giving me advice that prioritizes long-term relationship sustainability over short-term advantage. That's not how most lawyers think. It's how your Uncle David taught me to think, Martin said. He believed that the best deals were the ones where both parties felt like they'd been treated fairly, because those were the deals that didn't fall apart or lead to litigation 3 years down the line. My uncle speaks very highly of you, Victoria said. I called him last week to ask about your time at his firm. He said you were one of the most talented attorneys he'd ever mentored and that losing you to personal tragedy was one of his greatest professional regrets. Martin felt something tighten in his chest. I didn't know he thought about it that way. He also said, Victoria continued, that if I was working with you now, I should be patient and not push you toward anything you weren't ready for, because people like you who have real gifts also have real wounds, and rushing recovery never works. That sounds like David, Martin said quietly. I'm implementing your recommendations on the employment agreement, Victoria said. And Torres, I want you to know that what you're doing, this work you think is just side consulting, it's making a real difference. Not just for my company, but in how I think about structuring relationships and obligations. You're teaching me things I should have learned years ago but somehow missed. After the call ended, Martin sat in his van and thought about what Victoria had said about wounds and recovery and the difference between rushing and healing. He'd spent 7 years believing that the safest path was to keep his old life and his current life completely separate, to never let the lawyer part of himself contaminate the simpler existence he'd built as a delivery driver and single father. But the consulting work was proving that maybe those 2 versions of himself didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Maybe he could be both things simultaneously without one destroying the other. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, can you pick me up from Sarah's house after work? Her mom can drop me off if you're busy. Martin typed back. I'll pick you up. What time? 6 works. Thanks, Dad. Martin started the van and pulled back into traffic, thinking about his daughter and his work and the strange way life sometimes circled back to places you thought you'd left permanently. He had deliveries to make, contracts to review tonight after Emma went to bed, and a future that was starting to look different from the one he'd imagined when he'd first put on a delivery uniform and told himself this was enough, this was all he needed, this was where his story ended. Except stories didn't really end, Martin was beginning to understand. They just changed chapters, shifted direction, found new paths through familiar territory. And maybe that was all right. Maybe that was even how it was supposed to work. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 months after Martin had walked into Sterling Industries and noticed a broken seal on an envelope that should have been intact. Emma brought it in from the mailbox, a heavy cream-colored envelope with embossed letterhead that suggested formality and importance. It was addressed to Martin Torres, no return address, just a law firm's name printed in elegant serif font across the back flap. Martin opened it carefully while Emma poured cereal and got ready for school. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in fountain pen, the kind of correspondence that belonged to an earlier era when people took time with words because paper and postage weren't free. The letter was from David Chen. It read simply, Martin, Victoria tells me you've been doing excellent work for her company these past months. She also tells me you're limiting yourself to document review because you're not ready to practice law in any fuller capacity. I respect that boundary, but I'm writing to ask whether you'd consider having lunch with me next week. No agenda, no pressure, just 2 old colleagues catching up. I'm in Seattle on Thursday. Let me know if you're available. The restaurant choice is yours. Martin read the letter twice, then set it on the counter and finished making coffee. Emma glanced at it while eating her cereal. What's that about? She asked. Martin poured his coffee and sat across from her. Remember I told you I used to work for a lawyer named David Chen? He wants to have lunch next week. Are you going to go? Emma asked. Martin considered the question. Probably. It would be good to see him again. Emma studied him with the particular intensity teenagers develop when they're trying to understand their parents as actual people rather than just authority figures. You miss it, don't you? Being a lawyer. Martin thought about lying or deflecting, but Emma deserved honesty. Sometimes. Not the stress or the long hours or the constant sense that everything could collapse at any moment. But the work itself, the problem-solving part, yeah. I miss that. So why don't you go back? Emma asked. Like really go back, not just the consulting stuff you're doing now. Because I'm afraid, Martin said, surprising himself with the admission. I'm afraid that if I go back fully, I'll become the person I was before your mom got sick, someone who cared more about work than anything else. And I don't want to be that person again, especially not for you. Emma pushed her cereal bowl aside and looked at him with an expression that seemed older than 16. Dad, you were never that person. Even when you were working all the time, you were always there for Mom and me. You came to every school thing, you helped with homework, you made time. The problem wasn't that you cared about work too much. The problem was that losing Mom made you think you had to choose between having a career and being a good dad, and you chose being a good dad, which I appreciate. But you don't actually have to choose. You can be both things. Martin felt something shift inside his chest, some weight he'd been carrying without realizing it. When did you get so wise? He asked quietly. I've always been wise, Emma said, standing up to put her bowl in the sink. You just haven't been paying attention. She kissed his cheek and grabbed her backpack, heading out to catch her bus. Martin sat alone in the kitchen with David Chen's letter and his daughter's words echoing in his head. He pulled out his phone and typed a response. David, Thursday works. There's a place on Pine Street called Harvest Moon. 1 o'clock? The reply came within minutes. Perfect. See you then. The week passed in its usual rhythm of deliveries and evening contract reviews. Martin had settled into the dual identity now, delivery driver by day and legal consultant by night, and he'd stopped feeling like the two roles were contradictory. If anything, they complemented each other in ways he was still discovering. The delivery work kept him grounded, gave him structure and routine and regular human interaction. The consulting work kept his mind sharp, gave him purpose beyond just paying bills. Thursday arrived with unexpected sunshine, Seattle briefly remembering that other cities had weather that didn't involve constant rain. Martin took the afternoon off from his delivery route, something he rarely did, and drove to Harvest Moon 15 minutes early. The restaurant was the kind of place that prioritized actual food over trendy presentations, simple tables and good light and a menu that changed with seasons. David Chen was already there when Martin arrived, sitting at a corner table with a view of the street. He'd aged since Martin had seen him last, his hair now completely silver, his face carrying more lines, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence Martin remembered. He stood when Martin approached, and they shook hands with the warmth of people who'd once worked closely and still respected each other. They ordered food and made small talk about Seattle and the restaurant and safe topics that skirted around everything that mattered. But after their meals arrived, David set down his fork and looked at Martin directly. "Victoria told me what you did for her. The contract review, the broken seal, all of it. She said you saved her company from a merger agreement that would have been catastrophic." "I pointed out some problems," Martin said. "Your niece did the work of actually fixing them." "Don't diminish what you did," David said. "Most lawyers would have delivered the envelope and left. You paid attention to a detail that didn't directly concern you, and then you had the knowledge and the courage to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent. That's not common." "It's just attention to detail," Martin said. "You taught me that." "I taught you to read contracts carefully," David replied. "I didn't teach you to care about whether someone you just met was about to make a terrible mistake. That part was already in you." They ate in silence for a moment, and then David continued. "Victoria also told me you've been limiting your consulting work to document review because you're not ready to practice law more fully. I want to understand why." Martin set down his own fork and looked out the window at pedestrians moving past in the afternoon light. "When Clara died, something broke in me. Not just grief, though that was overwhelming. But this sense that my skills were useless. I'd spent 15 years learning to solve other people's problems, to negotiate deals and structure agreements and protect clients from risks they couldn't see. And none of it mattered when my wife was dying. I couldn't lawyer my way out of cancer. I couldn't negotiate with mortality. All that expertise I'd developed, it was completely irrelevant to the only thing that actually mattered." David listened without interrupting, and when Martin finished, he nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling. When my first wife left me, I felt similarly useless. I could read people brilliantly in professional contexts, but I'd completely missed that my marriage was falling apart. It made me question whether I understood anything real about human relationships or if I was just good at transactional interactions." "How did you get past it?" Martin asked. "I realized I was asking my skills to do something they weren't designed for," David said. "Legal expertise doesn't cure cancer or save marriages. But that doesn't make it worthless. It just means it has specific applications, and within those applications, it matters enormously. You can't save everyone, Martin. But you can make sure that the people who trust you with their business interests are protected from preventable harm. That's not nothing. That's actually quite significant." Martin absorbed this quietly. "So you think I should come back to practicing?" "I think you should consider whether you're staying away from practicing because it genuinely doesn't serve you anymore, or because you're punishing yourself for not being able to save Clara. Those are different reasons with different implications." The words landed with the force of truth spoken plainly. Martin had spent 7 years telling himself he'd left law because the emotional cost was too high, because he needed simpler work to be present for Emma, because practicing law reminded him of everything he'd lost. But underneath all those reasons, David had identified something Martin had been avoiding acknowledging. He'd left because on some level he believed his skills were worthless, and staying away from law was a way of accepting that worthlessness as permanent. What if I'm not ready? Martin said quietly. What if I try to come back and I can't handle it? Then you'll know, David said. And you'll make a different choice. But right now you're making choices based on fear of what might happen rather than evidence of what actually would happen. The consulting work you've been doing for Victoria suggests you can handle more than you think. The question is whether you want to. They finished lunch talking about other things, safer topics that didn't require Martin to examine his own motivations so closely. But as they stood to leave, David handed Martin a business card. This is my current office information. If you ever want to talk about coming back to practice, call me. I'm not offering you a job because I know you'd need to do it on your own terms. But I'm offering to help you think through what those terms might be. Martin pocketed the card and drove back to his apartment, his mind turning over everything David had said. That evening after Emma went to bed, he opened his laptop and looked at the consulting agreement he'd signed with Victoria 6 months earlier. It had seemed like such a big step at the time, agreeing to review documents for pay. Now it felt like what it actually was, a tentative first move back towards something larger. He opened a new document and started writing, not a formal plan but just thoughts about what it might look like to practice law again in a way that felt sustainable. Limited client load. Clear boundaries around work hours. Partnership with someone who understood that he needed flexibility for Emma. Focus on the work itself rather than building a large firm. It looked different from the practice he'd had before, smaller and more contained, but maybe that was all right. Maybe smaller and more contained was exactly what he needed. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Torres, sending you a contract tomorrow that's more complex than usual. Take whatever time you need. Also, my uncle called me after lunch with you. He seems to think you're considering coming back to practice. If that's true, I want to be your first client. Martin smiled and typed back. One step at a time. Let me see the contract first. He closed his laptop and sat in the quiet apartment, thinking about broken seals and second chances, about daughters who saw their fathers more clearly than the fathers saw themselves, and about the difference between running away from something and running towards something else. The past 6 months had taught him that his skills weren't worthless, that using them didn't mean abandoning Emma, and that maybe the person he'd been afraid of becoming wasn't actually who he'd been at all. Outside his window, Seattle settled into evening, the city's lights reflecting off low clouds in a way that made the sky glow with borrowed illumination. Martin thought about tomorrow's deliveries and tomorrow's contract review and all the tomorrows stretching ahead, full of possibility he'd stopped allowing himself to see. The road back to himself was longer than he'd expected, more complicated and less direct. But he was on it now, moving forward, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.